Workman. I am the president of CROHL, which is our lazy man's short for Citizens for the Restoration of Historical Lamont. And we are pleased to be presenting this program today. And it is our kickoff. 2023 is the 160th anniversary of the establishment of the United States Colored Troops in Camp William Penn. And again, with some of the chat before we started the program, you all know that we are using Zoom. And the reason for that is our local community center is still not available for public use. And that may continue for some time. Always, a light at the end of the tunnel. And today we have visitors from across the United States. And we also have an international attendee. So maybe next year we will have a site where we can do in-person with the audience and Zoom. We'll have to stay tuned on that one. A reminder that the museum will reopen by reservation the beginning of June. Also, the Camp William Penn 160th anniversary event, which includes historic Lamont Day, will take place on September 16, 2023. We found out last year that things happened and we were shorthanded. So we need to start recruiting for volunteers now. So if any of you are listening and you can volunteer to help us that day, we are going to be all ears and welcoming immediately. Again, the organizations that participated will be under tents because the community center will not be open. And there's one other item I want to mention before we get to our speakers. Last night, I discovered that the Chester County Historical Center, which is in Westchester, is currently showing the 17 pencil drawings of Camp William Penn soldiers by Shane Davidson, who lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I don't know if there's a way I can show this. Jim, is there a way I can show this?
If you can share your, do you have something opened already?
Wait a minute.
If you have something opened already, a picture?
Hold on.
Physically.
Here we go. All right. Shane Davidson is a medical illustrator in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And it's a long story which we tell in the museum. And I'm not going to tell it now because it will ruin the intrigue for if you come to the museum. So anyway, after she did the 17 drawings, she did this book. And the drawings in large size are spectacular. So they are currently on display at the Chester County Historical Center. I would like to bring these drawings to Camp William Penn, but we've not been able to figure out a good way to do it. But I have some ideas that I'm going to keep working on. If it's possible, it's a display worth going out to see. I visited them up in her third floor bedroom in Ann Arbor right after our 150th, and I've seen them on display elsewhere. Also, she will be doing a short Zoom presentation either Wednesday or Thursday evening, I'm not sure which, you can check out on the Chester County Historical Center website. And that would all be interesting. So I am going to introduce our speakers. The first is Dr. Gail Dawson. She is the great granddaughter of the Camp William Penn soldier that Dr. Hicks will be talking about. And she spent some of her life living across the street from what used to be Camp William Penn. And when her father discovered that Camp William Penn was across the street, there was no holding him back. She is now the Associate Professor of Management and Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Gary W. Rollins College of Business at the University of Chattanooga. She writes poetry, and I knew she had published a book entitled Straight to the Point, and it's poetry. And so today, as descendant, she will read two of her poems that are related to her ancestor and the current subject at hand. And then Dr. Robert Hicks will follow with no further introduction. He's the former director of the Mutter Museum and Medical Library. He's an author and much, much more. And he will talk about Prestley Dawson and how his war injuries affected the rest of his life. We'll take questions at the end. And in the meanwhile, please use the chat box to submit your questions. Now I'll let Gail take over. Gail?
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today to represent my father, Thomas Dawson, who attended many of your events. Also to represent my great-grandfather, Prestley Dawson, and the rest of my family. Family's always meant a lot to me, as it did to my parents. You see, both of my parents were part of big families. My mother was the 15th of 16 children, and my father was the 7th of 8. So as you can see, I have a lot of family. And growing up, I often attended family reunions with extended family. But it was kind of interesting because I almost had a sense that my family started with my parents' generation. And I say that because both of my parents lost their parents at an early age. My mother was only 6 when she lost her mother and 16 when she lost her father. My father was 12 when he lost his father and 22 when he lost his mother. So I grew up without grandparents. So I missed out on all the grandparent stories and the family history that's sometimes shared from grandparents to grandchildren. In addition, my parents never really talked about their parents or any of the previous generations. And I think part of that was because they didn't have a lot of information to pass down to my generation. I had the opportunity to read and listen to some of the slave narratives, part of the WPA project from the 1930s, where they sent people out to interview slaves or former slaves to try to capture some of the history of what it was like, that transition from being enslaved to being free. And one of the common themes from those narratives was that a lot of people said that they didn't like to talk about the past because it made people sad and made people feel bad. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of history because people didn't want to talk about things that made people sad, which kind of brings me to some of the things that are going on right now with a lot of people trying to ban teaching Black history and that kind of thing. But that's really where we get information about who we are. As a child, the only people that I really remember who were before my parents' generation, we used to go visit one of my aunts, my dad's father's sister, Aunt Bessie, who lived out in Westchester. And I also remember we used to visit a lady that I called Aunt Mitt, who I found out later was not actually related to us. but I'll tell you a little bit about that later. So I really had a sense of kind of trying to figure out who I was. I wanted to have that connection to ancestors, but I didn't have grandparents and didn't have those kind of stories. And I think we get a lot of who we are from hearing who our ancestors were. So the first poem that I'd like to share with you is called "Who Were Your Ancestors?" They were a strong and noble people whose lives were changed by fate, victims of an unjust world ruled by fear and hate. A shameful time in America's past, but it was not their shame. They were not the villains here. They were not to blame. Stolen from their native land, forced to be a slave. But don't think of them as weak. They were strong and brave. They did what they had to do in order to survive. Faith and ingenuity is what kept them alive. They coped with songs and laughter instead of hanging their heads to cry. And even through the worst of times, they held their heads up high. So when the history is told, you shouldn't be ashamed. Your ancestors were a noble people, their heritage yours to claim. And that's kind of what started me on my journey through genealogy. I wanted to know who my ancestors were. I started my journey in 1992, 93, somewhere around that area. I was working as a consultant in Washington, D.C., and I had done a consulting project in San Diego where I had an opportunity to catch up with one of my cousins, Roy, who lived in Bellflower, California, and he had done some research on the family. So I got a chance to see some of his files. And then later on in 1993, I was working in Washington, D.C., and I was able to spend some time in the National Archives. Now, when I started my journey, I was on a consulting project in Salt Lake City. And I found out that I was 2 blocks from the Family History Library in Salt Lake City that's run by the Church of Latter-day Saints. So when I finished my work every day, I would go over to the Family History Library. And I'll be honest, I was a little bit pessimistic. Although they have a large repository of family information, I didn't think I was really going to find anything about my family. But I went over there, I went through their training, and I started with the 1920 census. And I was able to find both sets of my grandparents in the 1920 census, which made me try to research a little bit further and find more information. I talked to my dad about what I had found. And at that point, he shared with me a little information about his grandfather, Prestley Dawson. And if you can see the picture behind me, it's a badge that says P. Dorsey, and it has information from the Civil War. Prestley Dawson was a soldier in the US Colored Troops. My dad showed me the badge, and he said that he knew the family name had changed from Dorsey to Dawson, but he didn't know why. And he said that his family really didn't talk about that. That was one of those things you just don't talk about. So he set me kind of on a mission to find out what I could about Prestley Dawson. With that information, I was able not only to go through the census records and work my way back census year by census year. So every 10 years, I was able to go back and try to find my family in the census. And I was also able to go to the records for the US Colored Troops, because on the badge, it says 43rd Regiment, US Colored Troops, and it has Pennsylvania, which is where he did his training and where he enlisted. So I was able to actually go to the National Archives and pull enlistment records. And I was able to locate his enlistment records. I had them sent out so that I could actually touch the same enlistment paper that my great-grandfather put his X on, which was a thrilling experience. It just gave me chills to be able to know that I actually touched the same papers that he had. The thing is, though, on his paperwork, it said Dawson instead of Dorsey. And that kind of gets to why the family name changed. When my dad said that the family name had changed from Dorsey to Dawson, it kind of reminded me that when we visited Aunt Mitt always called my dad Tommy Dorsey. That was all she would call him. And at first I thought it was that she was mispronouncing Dawson. But when he told me that the name had changed from Dorsey to Dawson, but didn't have the information on why, it started me kind of looking into some of the information. And what I found was Prestley Dawson was born in Howard County, Maryland, and he enlisted in the Civil War in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. At the time, like most people at that time, he could not read or write. So the enlistment papers were written out and he made his mark with his X in the spot that he was supposed to. And later when he filed for pension because of his injuries from the Civil War, the government could not find him as Prestley Dawson. So the name changed for the family to Dawson. And as I did research on census information, what I found was in 1870, my great-grandfather was listed as Press Dorsey. In 1880, he was listed as Preston Dorsey. 1900, again, he was listed as Preston Dorsey. By 1910, he had passed away, but my grandfather, John Dawson, was listed as Dawson, and all of his siblings were also listed as Dawson, where they had previously been listed as Dorsey. The other thing that I was able to find out through research through the National Archives, I found some of the depositions from the pension battle that Prestley Dawson went through. And one of the things that it says there is that after the Civil War, he, along with a friend of his, Armistead Williams, moved from Howard County, Maryland, to the Eastern Shore of Maryland in Caroline County. And it turns out that Armistead Williams was the father of Annie Williams, who's a lady that I knew as Aunt Mitt. So instead of her actually being an aunt, she was a friend of the family, and her father and Prestley Dawson were friends. So I grew up calling her Aunt Mitt though. But as I said, she always called my dad Dorsey because she had known the family when they were Dorsey. And although the government said that we had to go by Dawson because that's how they had him listed, she always called him Dorsey. But this next poem that I want to share with you kind of talks about that research journey and how you find a little bit of information, and sometimes that leads you back to a little bit more information. And it's really kind of a mystery that you're trying to solve. So this poem is called To Ancestors I Never Knew. You had no fame or fortune, no heirlooms to pass down. But when I took the time to look, true treasures what I found. You left no map to guide me. You barely left a clue. No beacon was there for me to see, to lead me back to you. But you left a buried treasure, more valuable than gold, a legacy that was your life, your story to be told. So I hope with each new nugget, it will lead me back to more. I know more about you now than anyone did before. I'm reaching out to you to find my legacy, and I can feel you reaching back to try to make me see. I pull you closer to me with each page that I review, and now I have a special bond to ancestors I never knew. I've spent a lot of time in libraries, National Archives, looking through microfilm and microfiche and hunting for those little things that'll take me back another generation or another 10 years. Unfortunately, I lose a lot of information in the Civil War because prior to the Civil War, those who were enslaved were listed on slave journals or slave registries, which really just listed them kind of like cattle. It listed age and gender, but nothing more. For those of my ancestors who were free, I've actually been able to go back to the 1840 census, where I find a great-great-great-grandmother who was born in 1800 and was a free person of color. I also find other parts of my family listed as free people of color. But I'm still searching. And one of the other things that I have done is I have done DNA testing through both Ancestry.com and 23andMe. And one of the newer things is that I, through my DNA, I've been linked to some people who are linked to Edward Dorsey, who's listed as being the patriarch of the Dorsey family that was a colonial family from Maryland. Edward Dorsey got to Howard County, Maryland in 1649. And I know my DNA matches his. I'm just not sure exactly where my family branches off from his, but that's something that I'm working on now to find out exactly how that link is made. So the journey continues. Thank you.
Robert, you're on.
We'll field questions at the end. If you can use your chat to enter your question, we'll have the list of questions to give to the speakers at the end.
All right. You can hear me? I'm not muted at the moment.
I hear you.
Good, thank you.
Hear
We
you.
can proceed. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for tuning into our presentation today. I want to thank CROHL for inviting me to talk. And I particularly want to thank Dr. Gail Dawson for her presentation and for her poetry. And I hope that my presentation also speaks to the themes of those poems. And her own research is definitely inspiring. Some of that was conveyed to me by her father. And I got to know her father for a few years before he died. He's going to come up in my presentation because it's him via CROHL that I was led to the Dawson pathway. And it was a fascinating experience. And as Dr. Dawson says, there are mysteries here and there are mysteries yet to be solved. I'm going to now switch to another screen where I have my presentation. Right, are we on?
I see your slides.
Okay, my slide's up on everybody's screen now. Jim? Somebody give me some feedback.
I see it.
I see it.
Okay, everybody can see it.
You're good,
All
Robert.
right,
I can see
so,
it.
great, we're good. All right, here I am with my tedious titles and the title of the presentation. And this particular image I'll actually return to a bit later because it does mirror my take on not only Dawson's life, but some other veterans in a larger project, which I will explain at the end. And with due acknowledgement of my own institution, I'm not the director of the museum there, but I'm still affiliated with the organization. And so I am representing that organization today. There is no photograph of Prestley Dawson that identifies him. The particular image you have in the lower right-hand corner, I throw up just to give you an image of a soldier of approximately his age and build. This soldier is also unknown, and I have some photographs of African Americans from the Dawson era, the end of the 19th century, and just know that they are not connected to the Dawson story, but they are simply people of that era who are stand-ins for the people we're talking about. So, begin in Petersburg, Virginia in 1864. Dawson's company has left Camp William Penn, has arrived in Petersburg to join the rest of the regiment, which has been there for some time. Now, the reason for the late arrival is the Army was so in need of troops to the front lines that they took the regiment before it was completely filled, which is why Dawson arrived a little bit later than everybody else and missed some significant action, probably fortunately for him. But he arrives in Petersburg and it's looking like this. It is hot. It's nasty. If you live through that part of Virginia, as I have in the summertime, it's a regrettable experience. But it's even worse if you're digging trenches and you're essentially rehearsing for a future war, World War I, which looks like this. And here you have some African-American soldiers at their ease in probably luxury accommodation in the Petersburg battlefield. So soldiers are in trenches and they're being shot at and they're shooting at the enemy. Nobody's really gaining much ground here, and their pressure is on for federal forces to break the stalemate because the end of the war is coming. The Battle of the Crater may be the most memorable event connected with the siege of Petersburg. Petersburg just south of Richmond, but also a source of supply, and it's a railroad nexus to the south. As you may recall from your own reading, the Union Army decided to try to break this siege by planting a mine under the Confederate lines, which exploded, as you see here in the illustration, and it created a breach in the lines. It disoriented the Confederates for a significant time. The problem was the crater that it left behind. And the soldiers that moved in, many of them got stuck in the crater. They filed in, they couldn't get out. More soldiers came behind them. The Confederates had time to regroup. And I'm making a very short story of a long moment. But as far as Dawson's regiment is concerned, the 43rd, and remember, this is without him, they actually did some fairly good stuff for the Army that day. They advanced ahead, managed to take more prisoners of the Confederacy than they had soldiers in their own regiment, brought them back, and even captured some Confederate flags. So when Prestley Dawson arrives, he probably is eager to find out all about this and probably is moving through the trenches with some of his associates to have things pointed out to him. And just as a footnote, when I had his name up as Prestley Dawson, just know that, as Dr. Dawson pointed out, his name has appeared differently in census reports and in other records. Every time his name appears in the historical record, it is recorded by somebody else, either hearing it said by him or copying it from somebody else. Because the man was not literate, we only have his X on documents. So the spellings vary on these documents depending on what is heard. It also is true for other aspects of his life, as we will get to. I don't know that you could say that Dawson was enjoying his time at Petersburg, but after he is settling in and he is getting accustomed to this form of warfare and to the heat and humidity that's oppressive, August 28th, an accident happens. Possibly under fire from Confederate cannons, part of these breastworks, these big stacks of heavy logs with uprights, falls apart, and it falls on him, and it injures his right leg. Now, we learned later that it dislocated his knee, and it crushed the upper bones of his leg, the tibia and fibula. What's significant here is he didn't get any medical attention that is discoverable. And even when the Army later on formally searched for his medical record, they found no evidence that this was ever reported to a medical authority. I think this is significant because a picture I have formed based on circumstantial evidence and the bits and pieces of clues that show up in all those records Dr. Dawson talked about is that this man was a strong man. He was apparently had good upper body strength. And I suspect, being a latecomer to the war, he was eager to get into the fray. And as long as he could function, even if lamed, he may have been willing to just, as they say, soldier on. I will come to a different conversation about the medical treatment he might have received or he might wanted to have avoided a little bit later on. So the color pictures here are reconstructions of some of those defensive structures down in the Petersburg area to show visitors to that area today what these look like. You had ditches to trap an attacking enemy, these upright logs, sharpened logs, and so on. Now, I had that date, August 28th, for a reason, because on or about that date, Dawson's bitten by a mosquito, an Anopheles mosquito. And this Anopheles mosquito had already bitten a soldier who had malaria. Malaria is an identified thing at the time. It has identified symptoms, as you see here, the sweating, the chills, the vomiting. We know that there are multiple strains of malaria. At the time of the Civil War, these different strains were differentiated length and duration of the fevers, the onset of fevers. And as most of you probably know, if you are a malaria victim once and you pull out of those symptoms, they can recur at any moment for the rest of your life. In this case, you see under Anopheles mosquito, the Latin name for the version of malaria that Dawson likely contracted. This is the most severe version of malaria available, and it was apparently introduced into North America by enslaved Africans in previous centuries. And it can get worse, and people can die from this. And at the time, palliative care was on offer. And most likely, these were mosquitoes that were breeding in the James River area, which was just close by. So this time, he's going to get some medical attention. But let's just pause for a moment. This is a You're seeing here the enlistment document that Dr. Dawson pointed out. She was actually able to handle this original document. And it says a lot of things. It has the name down as Prestley Dawson. As you see in the upper left here, he signs with a mark. It's for the 3 years of the duration of the war. It identifies his origin as Howard County, Maryland. I single this out because other documents in Dawson's military files, his pension files, show Harford County, Maryland, or Howard County, Maryland. They're pronounced so similarly that even if Dawson perhaps is telling an Anglo officer, Harford County, this might have been heard as Howard County, or it could be the other way around. There's a good argument, though, for why Howard County might have been the place of origin. I'll get to that shortly. But what do we know about him? Now that he's coming into the military, he's seeing a white physician for a physical examination. And this is the first time he's probably ever had anything to do with a white doctor. I believe, based on circumstantial evidence here, that Dawson had left an enslaved condition. Either he escaped or somehow got out of it, made his way to Lancaster, Pennsylvania to enlist. Whether he was talked into it, whether he had other fellows who were also enlisting at the same time, they did this together, all this is unknown. What we know is that he was born probably between 1840 and 1842, Harford or Howard County, as I mentioned. He's listed here as a laborer, which could mean anything, but it means unskilled, very hard labor. The enslavement issue is interesting because in all the pension records where there are numerous depositions by family members, I will get to a little bit later, they all say that this is something that was not talked about. Whatever Dawson did before the war, they did not know. They knew his origin story beginning with his Civil War enlistment. And when I asked Dr. Dawson's father, Thomas Dawson, the grandson of the soldier, the same question, he said, when he grew up, it was just something you didn't talk about. And you just knew that that origin story was just not to be permitted in conversation. So he never went there. He never found out. He never asked. For those of you that can read these things, the enlisting officer has an interesting name, by the way. He's an officer by the name of Thaddeus Stevens. If that name rings chimes for you, famous abolitionist member of the House of Representatives for Pennsylvania there in Congress at the time is Thaddeus Stevens. This is not the same Thaddeus Stevens. This is his nephew, who was an Army officer. Now, of course, Camp William Penn, we get some stats that are recorded by the government. And I should say that as these soldiers enlist and become soldiers of the government and maybe pensioned afterwards, they create a government record. And as far as I know, comprehensive health record of Black Americans in this country was by the federal government, the Black troops, United States Colored Troops. The records on them constitute that record. But we have some description of him at this time. He's about 5'8". He's later recorded as 5'9", dark hair, with a light complexion. And one of the census records, I believe, refers to him as mulatto, which was a category that was registered on the census occasionally, sometimes with hazel eyes. He has a scar. He was promoted to corporal very early on. And this was not unusual when masses of recruits come into the camp. Some of the officers are identifying some soldiers of promise who might have leadership qualities, and they make them non-commissioned officers to help manage this incoming horde that must be organized, disciplined, and trained. He retains that corporal rank for a while before he's reduced to ranks. I don't think that's a negative thing. I think that's an administrative decision that was made along the way that, okay, maybe Corporal Dawson did his bit, we're moving on. The fact that he was non-literate may have weighed against his permanent promotion to corporal. Hard to say. But it's at this time, of course, in the enlistment where the name change from Dorsey to Dawson occurs. Now, it's also not unusual for a soldier to adopt an alias in military service during the Civil War. Perhaps our man was escaped from a slave owner who might still be looking for him under the name Dorsey, perhaps that being the slave owner's name. That may have been a name he did not want to retain. Interestingly, though, he's going to choose that again later after military service. Meanwhile, back in Petersburg, Dawson this time is hospitalized at a place called City Point, which is right out of modern Hopewell, Virginia, which is a town that really has almost nothing to recommend it. But there's virtually nothing where you see all these structures in black and white today. This was an overnight city supply depot. It was a gateway to the north, staging area. It also had a vast hospital. So soldiers wounded in the interior are being brought here. This is a vast complex. There are approximately 10,000 beds in this hospital. There's segregated wards for the Black troops. And it may be unusual in that here is our man for a very extended stay for malarial debility. There's no mention of anything to do with his dislocated knee and lower leg injury. It's just for the malaria. The average hospital stay for a serious ailment was about 4 weeks to 6 weeks, and he exceeded that. So the malaria must have really kicked him pretty hard. And of course, we can expect this to show up again. So he's treated here, and he may actually have been treated by both African-American nurses and doctors, because there were some in the segregated wards at City Point. But Dawson returns to duty, and towards the end of the war, as Richmond falls, his regiment is one of the regiments to enter. Dawson's colleagues in the 43rd, who left any written record of this in their time in Petersburg, did point out what an attraction they were, both for white troops and also African Americans in the vicinity. And of course, down in Virginia, they would have seen plenty of enslaved ones, and they were really greeted as heroes, as victors. And as most of you know, when United States colored troops entered Richmond, they had a horde of followers. All these enslaved and the minor element of free blacks in Richmond showed up to cheer them on, accommodate them. Some people even reunited with families. So we can imagine Dawson enjoying this moment of victory entering Richmond. But then the war ends just a matter of days to weeks later. Many of the federal units are now beginning to muster out, but this does not happen to the 43rd Regiment. 43rd gets reorganized. All the Black troops now are being reorganized into a single, much larger unit of the 25th Corps with their own distinctive emblem, which shows up on the badge that Dr. Dawson was showing us. But what reward awaits them? They go here. The Army sends the 25th Corps to Texas. Now, the troops are not happy about this for a couple of reasons. One is all these other troops are being demobilized, and they are not. Also, now that Black troops have received the congressional decision to give them equal pay, rations that had been paid to their families have now been stopped. So here are these soldiers now moved farther away from their homes, and their families have lost rations. And so these soldiers now are expected to figure it out now that they get the regular salaries of the white soldiers, they can figure out those disbursements. Not easy to do when you're out in Texas. But this is an island, Brazos Santiago, which is a barrier island. If you look at the map right below it, you see that long side-to-side squiggly line of the Rio Grande River, and it empties to the Gulf of Mexico. That map does not show the barrier islands that are right outside of that entrance, and this is one of them. So imagine all these troops have been brought down by steamship, and they're dumped here. And I am not overstating the case when I say dumped. The Army made no effort to set up advanced supplies or camps. These men were simply dropped there as if they were just dropped on the moon and left to fend for themselves. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a second, but imagine the disorientation. There were some near mutinies here because of the pay to the families issue, and also the lack of rations. And not surprisingly, problems developed very quickly with lack of drinkable water and food supplies. And if you don't have fresh vegetables of a certain kind, scurvy is the result. And this begins to hit very hard. Now, the 43rd Regiment is going to move upriver. You see that the Fort Brown there outside of Brownsville, opposite Matamoros, Texaco. Mexico. This had been an important point for the Confederacy to evade the Union blockade. They would take goods down into Mexico, sometimes soldiers, and funnel them out of Mexico, or funnel supplies in through Matamoros, crossing the river into the Rio Grande, thus avoiding the blockade of the southern ports. But Brownsville, at this time, was not a good place to be if you're a Union soldier. If you're a Union black soldier, it's pretty much worse. This is an unknown story. The troops were here for many months and taken back east at the end of the year, 1865, to demobilize back east. It's estimated that upwards of 80% of these black soldiers got scurvy. Resources were in such short supply that some soldiers that had clean water were selling mouthfuls of water for $1 a gulp. That's how desperate this got. The Army did not supply. The Army completely ignored these troops. Forgot about them. This is one of the worst shameful moments in US Army history, and very few people know it actually happened. The other day, I went online to see if any of the Texas state historical markers, both at Brazos Santiago, at Matamoros, Brownsville, and surrounding areas of Texas, mention anything about the 25th Corps. Not a single mention. And all the Texas historical sites I visited, they say something about the Civil War, the activities of the Civil War in these areas. Absolutely zero mention of 25,000 United States colored troops left here and left there to their own devices. So there was, in fact, physicians who loudly complained about this, and there were complaints up the chain of command afterwards. But as the war was closing down, Reconstruction was kicking in, the Army made every effort to cover up the story, and they came up with the best solution of all, to blame it on the black soldiers, which is what you see in the yellow lettering below. They decided that, well, if all of this happened to these black soldiers, if they starved, if they got scurvy, this simply shows that the black body is just not up to the white body when it comes to exposure to the elements and strength and courage and all that. So there we are. But this is the second hospitalization for our man Dawson. And as you see here, he spent 3 weeks in the hospital just before the orders came through, finally, that soldiers were going to be pulled out and sent back east to demobilize. The report says that he had experienced four attacks yearly of approximately 7 to 10 days duration in all. Now, probably where they're getting that is they're interviewing Dawson to get that information. Dawson may be minimizing this. I suspect that Dawson, in the same thought as most soldiers, black and white, you wanted to avoid going to the hospital. If you had an association with a hospital at all in civilian life, it's simply a place where people go to die. It's not a good place to be. And there are other reasons, if you're a black soldier, why you wanted to avoid these hospitals. And I'll get to that. And now I'm getting to that. Black bodies and health. If we imagine that Dawson came from an enslaved background, he's likely to have his ideas about what constitutes health, what constitutes illness, coming from an enslaved community. He's certainly not going to get it from reading books, and he's not going to get it from white doctors. But there are significant differences between notions of health and healing in African-American communities and as practiced by white doctors in the Civil War. Dawson may have had linguistic difficulties communicating with white officers and white doctors. We know this happened because there are white doctors who commented on it. And we know that there are United States colored troop soldiers who wrote letters of complaint to higher medical authority and higher military authority to say, these doctors just don't understand what's wrong with us, and they just don't listen. Some of this could be dialect differences. And if you're not used to talking to an educated white person, well, and you come from maybe a southern place, who knows? There could be language barriers here. Also, it's commented on sometimes by the white physicians that they saw some earmarks of health irregularities in black soldiers in general due to their excess of emotion. In the movie Glory, you may remember, there's this fantastic scene the night before the assault on Fort Wagner, where the soldiers are singing and giving personal testimonials of their Christian belief, their patriotism, and what they expect to do in battle. Well, that activity was called a shout. And the white officers were always amazed to see emotional displays in both very fervent religious practices in the Union Army and also outside of those contexts. So they found some of the Black soldiers emotionally unstable, which was a character flaw and hence a medical flaw. So there are all kinds of presumptions built into the white medical world that are going to clash with maybe the expectations of a Black soldier. Now, quinine for malaria was a prophylactic. It was given in the Union Army, but here in the belief that there is a substantial difference between white and Black soldiers, quinine was viewed frequently as not important to give to Black soldiers because Black soldiers were believed to have an innate resistance to tropical diseases, yellow fever and malaria particularly, which is one of the reasons why Black troops were deployed so pervasively throughout the South. They could better handle it than whites. But you see the result. Where malaria was concerned, the mortality rate count was twice that for Black soldiers as it was for white. So we see this disjunction. And by the way, these disjunctions were picked up by many physicians who wrote about this, particularly after the war, in trying to weigh the differences between the performance of white bodies and Black bodies. And since I mentioned the term body, my following Dawson's pathway is not an attempt to create a fully rounded biography. I'm following the body here. I'm looking specifically at what happened to Dawson's body, how did it affect his life going forward. One historian coined the term pharmacosm to describe the spiritual and healing point of view, particularly in enslaved communities. Pharma from obviously pharmacy, or cosm from cosmos. And the key difference here that Dawson might have experienced before coming to the Army was a sick person in the enslaved community was not viewed as an isolated individual with an isolated ailment, but the entire community had to participate in the healing of this person because the restoration of that person's health is a restoration of community health. So that community involvement is a big difference between the attitude of white military medicine and what Dawson may have experienced and come to understand. Also, conjuring and the spiritual power not only inherent in people, but in things, in foods, in plants. That is also beyond the ken of white physicians, and there really were no white physicians in the Union Army trying to mediate these differences in any significant way. So after the war, after demobilization, Dawson makes it back. And by the way, getting out of Texas might have been a good thing. Absolutely no record of any soldier who spent time in Brownsville during those 6 months had anything good to say about the place. It was just sheer hell, sheer misery. But we know that Dawson wanted to come to Maryland. And there's only one reference in all the depositions in his pension record where he apparently disclosed something about his boyhood in either Howard or Harford County to one of his descendants. And it's a hint. There's nothing really firm about that. But Dr. Dawson mentioned Armstead Williams, or Armistead Williams, went by multiple spellings. Here's another enslaved man who teamed up with Dawson to come to Maryland. It evidently was the object of Dawson to come back to this territory, at least in a friendly part of it, and farm and build a life for himself and have a family. The quotation here about the splendid specimens of physical manhood comes from a newspaper article in a Maryland newspaper that talked about both Armstead Williams and Prestley Dawson as being a kind of a local pair. They were seen together, they were good friends, and they loved to perform feats of manhood for the delight of children, particularly feats of strength. And here's Dawson putting on his back a huge barrel of flour and carrying it about to the delight of onlookers that he could do such a thing. So that's where that expression comes from. But what's remarkable was to think back about his dislocated knee and those crushed bones. which were never medically attended to, but could have been with the medicine of that day. And we will come to learn that he is in chronic pain as a result of this. He walks lame, and we know from the record that every time he put his right foot down, it turned out a 90-degree angle as he walked. So he had a very distinctive walk at this time from the Civil War going forward. But he comes to Caroline County. Caroline County might have been a particular designation of value here because before the war, it was a huge underground railroad connection, and also approximately, I think upwards of 50 to 60% of the African Americans in Caroline County before the war were free blacks. So there was an opportunity to build their own infrastructure there and then continue to build on it after the war. It may have been an attractive place to come. It also may be a clue where the name Dawson came from. Dawson is a fairly common name among the free black community in Caroline County at that time. And it's time to start a family. Now, the farming part starts on a tenant basis. Dawson does not have the means to procure land. There is one piece of evidence that the Freedmen's Bureau, which was set up to help people transitioning from enslavement to freedom, get help. There is some evidence that the Freedmen's Bureau may have encouraged or somehow sponsored or somehow directed Dawson and Williams to come out to this part of Maryland. In any case, it's time to start a family. And Dawson marries in 1868 to Sophia Grace, and they have one child. But that marriage doesn't last long, and it appears to dissolve over the next 2, maybe 3 years. And then later on, in 1875, Dawson marries a second time to Mary Benton. And according to the pension records, Janie seemed to be the name she's referred to most often. And as Dr. Dawson mentioned, we had Preston Dorsey showing up in the census records and different names at different times. The name Press Dawson shows up several times in the record, and he may have gone by that with friends and acquaintances, Press Dawson. But Preston Dorsey, as he's now identifying himself, is a farm laborer with children now living in Henderson. So these are all contiguous places in and around Caroline County and adjacent counties. But it appears that the Dawson family is moving as tenant farmers. The record does show, not the pension record, but real estate records, that there are some land transactions that involve Dawson. He's taken out a mortgage. He's apparently worked out a couple of interesting deals, at least one with a white landowner who was a Civil War veteran who apparently was very sympathetic to helping demobilized Black soldiers get a start. The problem is Dawson doesn't seem to actually acquire free title to any land at this time, but he certainly has that as an aim. This is where we come back to Payne. Over 20 years, 25 years after the Civil War ends, Dawson finally seeks a pension. He must certainly know about pensions and know that they are available. He must certainly know veterans living in and around this area who know about these things, but he does not attempt to go after them. And it may be that the process is too daunting. It's very difficult to be successful getting a pension unless you go to a pension office, a pension attorney, or a pension broker, somebody with knowledge about the law. And the laws change every so often. And most applicants, white and black, may go through a couple of trial runs where they're unsuccessful in applications. And they wait, and the law changes, the law progressively liberalizes, they come back and try again, and sometimes successful. Well, here we have the original declaration for an invalid pension. Problems surface right away. How do you show you are who you are? If you don't have a driver's license like today, if you don't have a birth certificate. Well, Dawson has nothing like that. What you can do is provide affidavits of people who have known you for a long time and people who are judged to be credible. Well, Dawson has, of course, documents from the military to show he's justifiably a veteran. He has that documentation. But the pension people have to be skeptical about these things. A person could show up and claim anything. Well, here's Dawson, who's lame. He's got something he can show for it. But here's where the problem of the documentation starts to kick in. The Army has no record that he ever had a dislocated knee and that he was injured in the trenches in Petersburg. So is he making this up? This is a problem. He has this visible lameness, but that's not enough. You could fake that in front of a pension officer. Also, there's some pension rules now applying to black and white that can be difficult to surmount in some cases, and that's the manual labor standard and the vicious habits. To get a pension, you had to show that you either could not perform manual labor, which pretty much meant farming, roll up your sleeves, really hard stuff of no skill at all, or you had to show a partial disability, in which case you would get a prorated pension. But the vicious habits advised you that if whatever it is wrong with you has something to do with alcoholism or prostitution, well, you might forget that pension because the government doesn't want to subsidize that. So we've got challenges built into a system that are particularly challenging if you are a black veteran. Well, finally, at almost 30 years after his injury in the trenches, he gets a medical examination. The process is kind of slow here, but here you see a typescript of this. Now, these medical examinations are not ground up physical exams. They are specific to the claim made by the veteran. If you say it's my arm, they're only going to examine your arm. They're not going to check your heart. They're not going to check anything else. They'll take some baseline measurements of your respiration, your pulse, and your height and your weight, but that's as far as they'll go. So if you don't mention malaria, they're not going to talk about malaria. And in this case, all of the pension claims that Dawson pursued were about the knee and what he called rheumatism, which was an all-embracing term at the time for lack of motion, lack of feeling, muscular problems, problems in your gait, all of this. So he starts applying and gets his pension applications rejected. And the rejection really hinges on the lack of original documentation. Can we really say that this is a line of duty injury, even if we grant this man that he has a dislocated knee? What if he got it 10 years ago in civilian life? So these weigh against him. And when it comes time for these examinations, he's appointed to go to a place in Maryland, probably Denton, Maryland, where there's a standing board of 3 physicians who are going to examine him and question him. So once again, and for the first time since his Civil War hospital experience, he's going to be before doctors, white doctors, and he's going to have to answer questions and talk to them in a way that they understand. Now, notices here that he does get a $6 a month pension initially, and they do increase it in 1902 to $8 a month. Now, the difference there is $6 at this in our money is about $175, let's say $170. $8 was about $260. Now, to give you an idea, though, the impact that amount of money would have on him, that $175 or the $266 today has a buying power only about 3% of what it would have had in his day. So that money was a substantial boost to his life. Here you see some of the documents with the various rejections, which reiterate what I've just said. There was a lack of original documentation and there's skepticism. Now, I don't think the skepticism is being leveled at him because he's a black soldier. Pension officers were pretty serious about trying to mediate these claims, but taken as a whole, the best studies of the Civil War pensions tells us that black soldiers taken as a class of applicant were more disadvantaged than whites. And it even works in a slightly more insidious way. The blacker you were in applying, the less likely you were to get the pension you desire. The lighter your skin color, the more benefits you were likely to get from the federal government. So by 1904, we have this picture of him. He's 172 pounds now. Remember, he's about 5'9", so he's gained weight, but he's also more indolent. Whatever he's doing by way of farming, he can't use his right hand, practically speaking. He's lost partial use of it and partial feeling in it over time. He cannot bend over and touch the ground or touch his ankles anymore. He doesn't have mobility. He doesn't have flexibility. And heart disease is also something that was detected by the doctors. He has some kind of chronic heart condition, which is not going to get any better. They do find a scar that's over his dislocated knee that apparently maybe his skin split open at the time and just healed and he was left with a scar. We just don't know because, again, that is absent from the medical record. But it's interesting that here it is 30 years later after his original injury in the trenches, and his leg is too sensitive to touch without inflicting pain. In fact, the doctor examining his knee could feel bony protuberances of those broken pieces of tibia and fibula that apparently just sort of moved off target from the kneecap and were sticking up against the skin. And they continue to do that 30 years later. So you have to picture Dawson, however he's trying to manage his life, having a family, trying to work in fields, maybe moving farms, and he has this persistent and worsening pain in his leg. Now, we do know that he has some association with the Grand Army of the Republic, and I have a more dreamlike picture of the badge that's behind Dr. Dawson. And to revisit that badge, it has the name Dorsey on it. And by the time this pension application round is working for Dawson, he is using the name Dorsey, but he's also using the word Dawson. And he's trying to be consistent with the use of Dawson when he's talking to government officials, but it doesn't always work. His children stay with the name Dawson, but he goes back and forth. And the government picks up on this, and the pension office adds that fact to his record that Dorsey is also a name that he has been using. They didn't know that up until this time. It is possible that he got this badge at a meeting or a reunion of veterans through the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, this was a fraternal organization. It was also an intense lobbying organization, and its lobbying was responsible for the gradual liberalization of pension funds over time. By 1890, for example, you could claim a pension and for a disability that did not even have to be service-related anymore. Just the fact that you were a veteran was enough. Now, on this, it says Company H, 43rd. It has PA, Pennsylvania, where he enlists. On the left, his state of origin, Maryland, is abbreviated on the right. And at the bottom, where you see kind of a diamond shape with an inset square 25, that's the symbol for 25th Corps. So he likely did not get this badge at the time he demobilized, probably later. People selling these badges in this configuration would show up at these reunions, and you would step up and say, here's my name, these are these other pieces of data, and they would be stamped on the badge then, and you pay for it and walk away with it. This badge shows up in depositions by wife Janie later on as one of the two artifactual pieces of evidence that she was married to this man. So we know this has been in the family for quite some time and has been used to try to get government recognition. But in the new century, we have, again, some more mobility. You see the inset map for Queen Anne's County. We find the Dawson family living there, at least at one census. I think he's still trying to aim for self-sufficiency. He hasn't been able to make a go of farming to such a degree that he's accrued capital. He's mortgaged property, but those mortgages apparently somehow dissolved over time, and he doesn't seem to have been able to hold on to these properties, even buying property that he was not farming, but maybe have intended to farm on. There are aspects of his life we just don't know. To what degree he participated in a faith community, which is likely, we simply don't know. That does not appear in the records, at least that are discoverable so far. And then he dies in 1907. And at the time he dies, this is the personal property that was officially recorded for legal purposes. No land. But he owns farm tools, he's got a horse and a cow. And that's pretty much it. So that leaves Janie. Now, with Dawson dead, his pension body is still intact. That's a body that still can spin off benefits for survivors. Now, again, this is not a picture of Janie. Again, these are just representative people at the time that I'm using to stand in for the people I'm talking about. She has no income. She's 65 years old. How does she prove her identity? Well, she's the second wife. She's got 4 children. She's got the badge. She's even got a faded photograph that apparently no longer survives. And she applies for a pension through a pension attorney, and it's turned down, with the ruling that she was never the lawful wife of Prestley Dawson. Now, this sounds pretty outrageous. Problem was, at this moment, the government did not have a record of Dawson's original marriage. There was no record of a divorce from her, and there was no record of a marriage. Now, as I said, the Pension Bureau tried to do a diligent job on these things, and they didn't treat her claim casually. They sent down a pension investigator to visit county records in Caroline County and adjacent counties and interview people and obtain depositions of people who had been witnesses to the marriage of Janie and Dawson. And what he did find was an original marriage certificate for the first wife, but never a divorce record. But did interview the person who actually buried Sophia Dawson. The first wife had died, but that wasn't enough. Pension Bureau stuck to it. Janie made repeated applications for a pension that she probably could have achieved, if successful, between $6, maybe $10, maybe even $12 a month, which would have been a significant piece of income for somebody with no income and of her status. So she gets rejection upon rejection upon rejection. Eventually, she gives up and she moves to Westchester, Pennsylvania, where she lives with relatives. And she goes back to work. And she works till the day she dies. In 1922, she dies of, the official record at the time was apoplexy. It's a stroke. She finally just dropped dead from working. And she never received a pension and had to live on whatever meager money she could get, and relying on the kindness of relatives to put her up. So, an unfortunate end. Now, in looking at the life of Prestley Dawson, and my focus as looking at his body from the Civil War forward and what happened to his body and how that influenced his life going forward, we don't have specific records of the malaria recurrences in his time in Maryland, but we know they must have happened. There's one reference to malaria in one of the depositions given by family. But there are 3 bodies at work here. There's a civic body, which is Dawson, his marriage, his working life, his military background preceding his post-war life, and how he managed to conduct that. And we can only guess at how he was able to pursue that very strenuous manual labor with the disability he obviously carried that was not compensated and was not initially examined. So that constitutes his civic body. His negotiations with the pension is a pensionable body. How he presents himself to pension authorities may be very different from how he presents himself to family, friends, business associates. And we know this particularly from white veterans who, of course, in looking for disability payments, they could be bankers who don't require, that doesn't require manual labor in the field. But when you go before a pension authority, you're claiming a total disability, say, because you can't perform manual labor. That's the standard. They don't care if you're a bank executive. Dawson doesn't have all those options available to him. He can only present himself to pension authorities as best he can as a very hardworking laborer. But there's a third one that we can't really explore because the records just aren't there, and that's the veterans body. The GAR participation might have been very important in Dawson's life, as it was for a lot of other Black veterans, because GAR, by its charter, did not discriminate between Black and white. And it was the only opportunity for Dawson and for a lot of Black veterans to participate on an equal social plane with fellow veterans in a very prestigious and influential organization. So it was hanging on to an important status that you would carry through life, and obviously is a reflection on an elevation of manhood from an enslaved. So we have a veterans body, which we don't know too much about in this case, the pensionable body and the civic body. Now, why am I pursuing all this, and particularly in this way? In 2013, at the Mutter Museum, we opened for a 6-year run an exhibit on Civil War medicine, and I wanted to make it personal. And we focused on a white nurse, female nurse, a white soldier, and a black soldier being Dawson, to personalize the medical picture and the differences between how the black man experienced the medical world and how the white one did. And it was through that, in the search for a representative black man, that CROHL was the right venue, because the irrepressible Thomas Dawson was there, and we became friendly, talked to him a number of times, and about family background, most of which had nothing to do with his grandfather, but simply with this amazing family that the grandfather ushered into the world. That brings us Dr. Dawson today, and as a university professor, and all of her siblings and extended relatives are doing amazing things. So this is where I really learned that message, that there are things that you didn't talk about growing up in an African-American family in the early 20th century, where enslavement was sort of a backdrop that people wanted to escape and not talk about. And it turned out there was very little that Thomas Dawson was able to tell me. But I decided that because there seemed to be information that was not clear, a lot of ambiguity, a lot of unknowns with Dawson, that I needed to pursue this man and see what I could find because of this project. This is my larger project. I've completed a book, not published yet, Wounded for Life, 7 Union Veterans of the Civil War. I look at, as a veteran of the war, one doctor and these other men here. And it's a cross-section of American life. Shields and Dunphy are both Irish immigrants coming to this country and serving the Union cause. We have Heidekopper, who is a Dutch descent. We have Kircher, who is a first-generation German-American in a German-speaking Union regiment. And we have 2 African-American soldiers, one Dawson and the other one Thomas Hawkins. Now, the physician is a connecting link to all the white or all the white soldiers here. He either communicated with them, examined them, spoke to them, but he had some relationship because he was a pioneer of neurology and effectively created the discipline of neurology in medicine. And his work in understanding injuries of nerves was crucial in the dialogue with those. But Mitchell didn't see black soldiers. So Hawkins and Dawson fall outside of that kind of medical attention. So their trajectories turn out to be rather different. So you'll have to wait for the book to get all the details. So back to this image again. I like this triptych here because it's got a before, a during, and an after. And it speaks to, in a way, the 3 bodies of Thomas Dawson, of Prestley Dawson, in his pre-war life, his Civil War existence, and then his post-war existence, which, as you see here, is very much dependent on what happened to him during the war. Oops. So, if you have not been to Washington, D.C. and seen this monument, put it on your map to make sure you see it the next time you're there. And Corporal Marquette here, who works at the African American Museum across the street from this monument, is pointing to Prestley Dawson's name that's on the roll of honor just behind this monument. So I thank you very much. And over to you, Jim and Joyce.
Oh, thank you very much, both Dr. Gail Dawson and Dr. Robert Hicks, for a really interesting program. Oh, let me put my phone here. Now we have some questions from the chat, if you could answer these. Actually, one question, Joyce, is about our website. It asks, how do we obtain the recorded program here? Well, we're going to try to put it on our website. That is usct.org. And Don't go to it right after the meeting because it may take us a couple of days to extract it and post it. And then we should mention too, on that website, you can go to our database and archives, which was put together by Ed McLaughlin. It is a magnificent collection of documents, and many of the things that you heard about today from both our speakers you will find every soldier from Camp William Penn regiments, every soldier. And there will be a remarkable number of documents. The service record, which tells you what he does in the service, what will happen to him, and things that he has to purchase, equipment issued to him, things like that. And then the pension records, which is a treasure trove of information about personal information that you heard about from both our speakers today. So you want to be sure to go to our website eventually to if you want to go to the recorded meeting, but there's wonderful archive and database that you can access to. Another question is, Dr. Dawson, you answered this in the chat, but maybe you'd want to address this too. The question was to you, how do we get copies of your poems?
I have published a book. If you'd like to purchase the book, you can send me an email at freetobegad@gmail.com. If you just want a copy of one of the poems, you can also send me an email and I'll get you a copy of it.
Okay. Many people have put up a thank you, and very happy with all the information. Now, one question is about the 22nd USCT, 22nd US Colored Infantry. They trained at Camp William Penn too. Well, just if you could contact us. There's so much information I could share with you, and books from which you can get more information. But the 22nd US Colored Infantry, just very brief rundown. They did a number of, they were involved in a number of important battles, suffered quite a number of casualties, and they did some unique things. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, they needed a military unit to accompany his coffin from the White House to the Capitol, and then from the Capitol to the train to make the tour of the country. They were chosen because they had a particularly good military bearing, and there was one white regiment, one black regiment that accompanied Lincoln's coffin in this procession. And at one point, the 22nd U.S. Colored Infantry led the procession. Also, at this time, they were sent off in pursuit of Lincoln's assassins. They hadn't been captured yet. That's another job that they were assigned to. So the 22nd U.S. Colored Infantry had a number of interesting things historically. If you could contact me, that's Dave.
Yes.
If you could contact us, we'll give you a couple of other books that you could go to with more information. I mean, there's besides Bates' History of Pennsylvania Volunteers, the last volume of that, I think volume 5, has information about brief histories of the unit. Also in Philadelphia in the Civil War, a book by Frank Taylor. There's a brief history of the unit. And if you want to look at more of the things they did, there's a book by Noah Andre Trudeau. It's like Men of War, and it is it talks about all of the black regiments in the war, but it will if you go to the index under 22nd USCT, you'll see all those things that they did. Another question from Dave, and maybe somebody could help us with this, especially people who are either reenactors for USCT or other roundtables. Is there a Civil War roundtable? that focuses on USCT.
Hmm.
Can anybody help us out with that? If not, Dave, how about we start one?
That'd be great.
Yeah, so let's if you could contact us on that, then we'll see what we can do to either find one or connect with one that already exists, or why not start one and let people know about it? There might be more people interested in it than you think.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Does anybody know about? I know there are meetings of reenactment groups that, of course, focus on that, but I don't know about a roundtable. If anybody knows about that, let us know, and we'll get that information to Dave. Thanks.
Thank you.
We can open this up to any questions that people have for our speakers. Can everybody unmute themselves? I better allow people to unmute, I guess.
Well, do we have any more questions?
Yes, I have a question, please.
Yes.
Sure.
Robert, during your presentation, you mentioned that families of soldiers were receiving rations. I was not aware of that. Maybe I misunderstood it. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I'd have to dig up notes on this, but one of the reasons that there was some mutinous sentiment with the 25th Corps going to Texas was not everybody, but some families in some regiments were receiving rations directly sent to their spouses. I'm not sure whether they were state arranged. I don't imagine that they were federally arranged. But in any case, they were cut off when Congress finally approved equal pay. And that's the extent of the information that I have on that right now.
Okay, thank you. That's a very interesting topic, something to research. I was not aware of that.
Yes, hello, I have a question.
Yes.
Yes, hi. I'm sorry I had to duck out for a little bit, but I came back on. Very, very interesting and information. Just wondering, would you happen to have any detailed research on some of the USCTs in Southeast Pennsylvania?
I would regard that as an open question. As far as Southeast Pennsylvania is concerned.
Well, let me be a little more specific.
Okay.
Okay, I'm thinking Chester County, Tredyffrin Township. And the reason why I ask is because my church, Mount Zion AME Church in Devon, Tredyffrin Township, Chester County, we have quite a few soldiers in our small church cemetery, USCT. So I was just wondering if you happen to have any details about soldiers in that area.
Joyce, the name is just eluding me at the moment, but you, woman that you had for a speaker who's written a book.
Oh, Hintonville.
Pardon me?
It was about Hintonville.
Yes.
Cheryl Gooch, Dr. Cheryl Gooch.
That might be a
Dr.
good place
Gooch.
to start. That book might be a good place to start because a number of the USCT records that she examined were of Chester County based
Right.
soldiers.
And that was Hinsonville's Heroes,
Yeah.
and the author was Dr. Cheryl Gooch, Gooch.
Right, and she's down there at Lincoln University.
Yes, she
Uh,
is.
Down that area.
And a number of years ago, there was a special display and exhibit put on by the county, I believe. It was in Norristown. And we listed all of the Chester County soldiers. Most of them went to the 54th because the problem was there were no USCT. And so when Camp William Penn was established, we got our soldiers from all over the place, but very few local. So you kind of have to look out beyond our local involvements.
Yeah, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued at the beginning of January, and Pennsylvania didn't raise any Black troops until well into the summer. And now, on the other hand, Massachusetts had an abolitionist governor, and he jumped on it and organized the 54th. There actually weren't enough. There wasn't a large enough Black population in Massachusetts to fill the regiments they wanted to create. So they actually sent recruiters to the Philadelphia area and Harrisburg and other places in southern Pennsylvania. And because there was such an opposition to this in Pennsylvania, they sneaked out small groups of volunteers at night on a train, sending them up to Massachusetts. So actually the 54th Massachusetts had more soldiers from Pennsylvania than from Massachusetts.
That's right.
Also, if you have names of soldiers in your cemetery that you want to research, you can check Ed McLaughlin's work, which is on our website, which will tell you when they enlisted, when they mustered out, and probably, if it was possible to find it, he will have additional details. And that's all on the usct.org website.
Yes, and I see that Ed McLaughlin is on this call, and yes, I bought all of his books, and yes, I have searched all of our names, and but I was also interested as far as the medical, Dr. Hicks, with your presentation, I was wondering if you had any detailed research about soldiers in like I said, Southeast Pennsylvania, and I'm talking about different townships specifically. Which I know is a little drilled down, but as opposed to Lincoln University, which is further south in Chester County, I'm talking further north and east, and so that's why I was asking.
I have one hint, but it's kind of a long way around. If you say identified some soldiers from the area that you are particularly interested in, and you look up their pension records, if they went through a medical exam, the pension doctors' names would be on there. And most likely they're not government employed at all. They receive a payment from the government, but they're physicians in private practice. And I know that Dr. Gooch, I have a book that's a diary of a Civil War physician from Chester County. And I know she found his name as a pension examiner for a lot of USCT soldiers in Chester County. He shows up as the pension examiner. So that's kind of a round way to do it, because you'd identify the physicians, and it's possible you could find some interesting records on these physicians and learn something about their practice.
Okay.
The
Very
chances
good.
are, if these veterans became sick later on, if they could afford it, they just went to a private doctor. If they were in discussion about a pension, in application for a pension, they had to go before the authorized physician at one of these boards. And they are frequently discoverable. Once you see their name and where they practiced, you can do other searches and locate them and find something about their practice. You found that some of the doctors examining were actually African-American doctors. I'd like to know about that because I've never run into that yet.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there is a book out. It's very recently. It's a small monograph. It's about the medical doctors, Black medical doctors who served in the Union Army. Mostly, they didn't have them work with white troops, but in what they call contraband hospitals, or with taking care of wounded black soldiers.
And
But they-
don't overlook the Freedmen's Bureau either. The Freedmen's Bureau records might have some records of those doctors who looked at veterans.
Well, one of those doctors, shortly after the war was over, was promoted to the rank of a lieutenant colonel, which is the highest rank achieved by any black man up to that point, and I don't think would be for many years later.
I was surprised to run into his name in my other USCT soldier that is the one you recommended, Jim, and that's why I investigated him, Hawkins. His second child was actually delivered by Alexander Augusta.
Oh, how about that?
Oh, wow. So is that Thomas Hawkins, the same one from the 60 USCT?
Yes, same one.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Since I have the floor, if I may ask, where are Prestley and Jenny Dawson buried? Do we know?
Gail, you still there?
I'm still here. I do not know.
Yeah, I don't know either.
I'm just wondering, because given that Jenny lived in Westchester, there's a black cemetery outside of town called Chestnut Grove. And I'm wondering maybe if that's where she's buried, so. I'll go down there and find out.
Please, if you find her, please, yes, let us both know.
Yeah, oh, you bet, absolutely.
I think if Ed is still on the line, Ed McLaughlin, would that be in your database?
Let me unmute. I don't know. I just can't believe what I can find online. Just my advice to anyone, pick and poke everywhere. Find a grave. I even found stuff on eBay. Someone's selling photographs.
Yeah.
But it's everywhere. It never stops.
Mhm.
I would have to check and see if stuff.
And don't worry, I just thought of it since I had everybody's attention.
But go to the website. There's all their.
Yep.
I have every single one of their military records from Fold 3. There are some death certificates. Occasionally, there's some photographs, and a lot of death certificates. A major research benefit there with the death certificates because they list the reason of death.
Dr. Hicks, would you mind stop sharing your screen so we can see each other? Thank you.
Okay. Are you not seeing me?
I see you, yes, but I can
Right.
only see a few
Oh.
people.
Well, he's the best looking one of us all.
I don't know how to undo my. Anyway.
You don't need to see the rest of us.
Okay.
So now I can say I've been on TV.
Jim Mundy.
A nice presentation, Dr. Hicks.
Oh, thanks, Ed.
Always. I think it's the third time I've heard it, and it's always fascinating.
Robert, I think what
Thank
they're
you.
asking is, Robert, if you would go to the top of your screen and unclick the share screen.
Okay, unclick the share screen. I'm not seeing that on here.
Should be in the right hand, like a red line on the right hand side at the top.
Yeah, how do I, right now, wait a minute. Right now, I've got a block of images of all of you, but I don't have, sorry about this. How do I get it on full screen?
Oh, you can click view. There's a view in the upper right-hand corner, and you could have either a gallery screen, which has a whole bunch of faces, or speaker, which focuses on the person speaking at the time.
Okay,
He can just.
reason I'm not getting that.
On the X over his share screen.
Oh, it's on my other, I got two screens here, and I thought I was,
Okay.
here we go.
Oh, are you sophisticated?
May I say something? I just put out another presentation. I gave it to Joyce. She knows about it, but I found all of Harriet Tubman's pension records. She married a Camp William Penn soldier, so I was going to print it out for Joyce, and I said, "Boy, that's a lot of printing." So I said, "I'll let Amazon do it." But there's almost 400 pages of pension records.
Wow.
Some of it just says she has a couple chickens, but there's some useful information in there also.
I'm sorry, what did you want me to do on the view on the upper right?
I think, is it gone now?
What was,
It's now.
Yeah, he got
fine.
it. It's
Thank you.
okay. He got it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I clicked
Thank you, everybody.
and participants sharing.
okay.
So any other questions or comments?
Only say bravo, Robert. Great job.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, Gail,
Thank
thanks
you.
so much for a
Done.
personal touch.
Yes, Gail, that really gave us a good basis for what Robert had to talk about. And I hope we have you again sometime. So I would like to just say thank you to all of you who came and had an interest in this. I look forward to seeing you at the museum or in September at Camp William Penn Day. And thanks to one and all. And I think, Jim, you can end the recording.
Okay, if anyone wants to stay around, Dave, I don't know if you're still here to talk about either the 22nd or finding out about a Civil War roundtable focusing on USCT.
We can still end the recording.
Okay, I'll stop the recording.